I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Devon Love, who is the Director of Public Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, has produced a new article that is, as is the case with all of the work that he and his crew do at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Oh, you know what? Let me fix that real quick. Let me get my background back. The Baltimore Brew is a tool of white supremacy. And as he'll talk about, the Baltimore Brew is a program in Baltimore, an online publication that has covered many corruption stories that implicate a variety of people and institutions. While there's corruption in politics that is carried out by Black elected officials, this is often overstated by many of its readers as the reason Baltimore continues to struggle. So that's the sort of immediate or one level of the criticism that Dayvon is bringing. But another that seems to have drawn some concern from segments of Black activism and Black radical politics is another section of the piece here that we'll get Dayvon to elaborate on, where they talk about white folks are used to having power over Black elected officials. Black people who aspire for public office are often straddling the worlds of garnering white social and political capital while trying to maintain credibility amongst Black people. These worlds are sometimes at odds with each other and in some ways overlap. There are occasions where a Black political figure is able to develop a strong and enthusiastic base of support among working class Black people. Black political officials and organizations that have solid working middle class base are a threat to white political formations, regardless of ideology. Those with working class Black bases can choose to be complicit in the system of white supremacy or challenge it. They can choose to use that power to empower their community, or they can use that power to enhance themselves personally. But having this base constitutes a political threat that, regardless of how it is used, is threatening to white institutions' ability to curate Black civic and political life in their interests. Of immediate importance to Dayvon is the coverage of Nick and Marilyn, primarily Marilyn Mosby, who, as he says here, are not unlike any other Black politicians that have had to straddle these worlds in order to become elected officials. They have been able to garner a working class Black base that, particularly in Maryland's case, is empathetic in their support of them electorally. This enhances their potential to act more independently of white institutional control than some other Black elected officials. There are legitimate things to both criticize and praise these policies and politics of the Mosbys. The mistake of their many critics, particularly of Maryland, is that they are not speaking to Black working class people outside the so-called activist circles. That is, the critics, Devon Love is saying, of Marilyn Mosby are not speaking to Black working class people who have become part of Mosby's base. They are speaking to the so-called activist circles. These activists are often louder than their actual connection to the broader non-activist community and are typically adjacent to white hipster liberal mainstream nonprofit networks who will use causes to shore up their social justice credibility. This is important to mention here because there are some of her critics who attribute her general imperviousness to criticism to protection from Black establishment connections. While this may be partially true, what is more true is that her activist critics speak to Twitter and the hipster nonprofit white liberal crowd more than they do the base of working class Black support that has elected her twice. Again, regardless of what anyone may think of her body of work, she is more legitimately a voice of Black people than many of her activist critics. So, as some might imagine, for those engaged in Black radical politics at all, outside of a sort of an understanding of nuance of Baltimore city politics and more broadly speaking, activist politics, there has been some concern and some even claims that Dayvon is supporting or encouraging Black support for establishment politicians. So I did not get that reading, but admittedly others apparently have. And we, of course, want to have Dayvon come on and talk with us about it and what he was trying to do beyond my own ability to interpret it. So Dayvon, I keep wanting to say good morning. Good afternoon. It's good to see you again, my man, and welcome back. And let's get right to it. What are you saying here? What is being misunderstood? What are you saying, and why is it being misunderstood in some circles as you supporting or calling for the support of these mainstream politicians against whom many of us feel we should be struggling?
And so appreciate you for having me on it to talk about this. And I felt that this was particularly important to talk about. I figured that it would be read the way that I think a bunch of folks are reading it. And so let me first talk about the reason why we wrote it. One of the things that's happening, and you had me on your show a few months back, a piece that we wrote about cracker democracy around the emergence of the progressive mainstream. And this progressive mainstream has increased in terms of its level of influence in what people call radical politics. So a lot of the funding, a lot of the platforms where people are projected as leaders on issues of racism and social justice are now more heavily curated by folks, by the kind of white hipster liberal nonprofit networks. And oftentimes they elevate certain kinds of Black voices that don't challenge their power to engage in this kind of curation. So what has happened in Baltimore over the past 4 years or so, there have been Black politicians who've been investigated by the federal government, where the press played a significant role in helping to legitimize those criminal investigations. And for anybody that's clear about history knows is that regardless of how Black political power is used, there is an assault both from federal government agencies, those networks within the DOJ and FBI that have units that deal with Black political officials, but also the history of the press projecting notions of Black criminality and pathology onto Black political and civic life. And so this pattern over the past 4 years or so has created a discourse where Black political figures are subject to a level of scrutiny that can be applied to Black organizations, right? And Black political figures. And that's something that I think is particularly important and that's why in that piece that you read where I mentioned that, regardless of ideology, Black folks with a level of an independent base are a threat to the ability of the mainstream to be able to impose its will, right? And it's important that we know that as a community so that today it's Marilyn Mosby, right? Tomorrow it'll be other political organizations. And what's not in the piece, but something that has happened since the piece has been written, is that there have been veiled threats made of LBS, veiled threats that have been made by folks in establishment positions, right? That I can't, get into all the way here, but I mention it for the purpose of explaining to folks that one of the people I mentioned in the piece is Bob Embry. Bob Embry is the president of the Able Foundation. And one of the things that I argue is that Bob Embry is much more significant in the political landscape than Marilyn Mosby. In the piece, and you didn't read this part, but there's a piece where I offer an example of a criticism of Marilyn Mosby, and there are lots of criticisms to be had. But Bob Embry,
you talk about like the Tyrone West case and stuff like that.
Exactly. Like Tyrone West, who was killed by police officers in July 2013. And we've actually confronted Marilyn Mosby as to the fact that she should have reopened that case, right? Bob Embry has way more influence over Baltimore than Marilyn Mosby does, right? And regardless of what we think of Marilyn Mosby in terms of her politics, Marilyn has an ability to act more independently, not in a revolutionary way. And nowhere in the text do I claim that Marilyn Mosby is a revolutionary, but she's able to act more independently than other folks for whom have to adhere to the likes of a Bob Embry. right? Or to the likes of a Greater Baltimore Committee, right? Or to the likes of, many of the other major institutions that actually wield power, in this region that that undermine the quality of life of Black people. And so that was really our point, was to try to get people to be clear that we should not allow entities like the Baltimore Brew, which is a small, kind of medium-sized news outlet that is gained in terms of credibility locally. We shouldn't allow entities like that to project these notions of criminality onto Black political and civic life, especially if they're not doing that in ways that would highlight a Bob Embry, right? That would highlight these major institutions that actually have a much greater impact on the suffering masses of Black people in Baltimore, right? And I think a part of what happened was people took it as caping from Maryland or something, and to me, it just felt like people didn't actually read it. What people want is the groupthink, Twitter, fake woke thing, right? Which is to join in with the groupthink and go after Marilyn Mosby. And again, we criticize Marilyn for things, but we understand where the real power is in terms of what is hurting Black people in Baltimore.
Yeah, I just want to quickly acknowledge, Dayvon, I don't know if there's anything you can do, but we have a little bit of a connection issue. I think that's on your end. I don't see any sign over here that I can do anything, but just, I don't know whatever your situation is, but just heads up on that. And I do just want to take the moment also, there are there's over 100 people watching and we only have 45 likes. So people should like, subscribe, and join. That number is clearly out of whack. But I did want you to talk a little bit more about the details of the structure of Baltimore and why Embry has so much power, as you say. Also as a way to describe for people not in Baltimore, who likely find themselves in similar situations in terms of the structural political media apparatus that they're stuck in. Why does somebody like an Embry have more power than a Mosby, than you say? And then, because I think this is part of the nuance that involves, that we can maybe get to beyond that. But why does Embry have this much power? Yeah.
And I hope the connection is better. I adjusted something, so hopefully the connection will be better. You can just let me know while I'm talking if it goes out. Bob Embry, in many respects, is someone who he's in his 80s and came in through William Donald Schaefer. William Donald Schaefer was elected mayor in 1971. I imagine around the country, there are folks who operate behind political figures, who have relationships with the federal government, within philanthropy, within law enforcement, that serve as the actual masterminds behind the scenes in terms of actually structuring much of what happens in major regions, in major cities, urban centers. And so when you listen to people like Barbara Mikulski, or you listen to any of the establishment political figures, they describe the role that Bob Embry had in terms of being an architect. Whether it's and so this is something that I relate to cities around the country. There's downtown was heavily invested in, the Inner Harbor, and at one point, folks said that it was actually competitive with Disney World. That in terms of tourism, the idea being, and it's the same kind of neoliberal economic model: bring tourism, bring corporate sponsorship, bring major companies to downtown, and that will have an impact on the entire city. What has actually happened is that downtown development has made, those who are in the corporate world more money, and has only made primarily available to the majority of Black folks in this town service level jobs that pay, slave wages. And so that's the economic model that Bob Embry was able to be the architect of. And so because of the multiple worlds that he's able to live in, philanthropy, civic world, business, this is somebody, for instance, has had the ability to curate Black political and civic life. I remember, and I can say this now, she's no longer in office. I remember years ago at a meeting at church where Catherine Pugh, who at the time, she's former Mayor Catherine Pugh, who at the time was a state senator. And I remember asking her about, ways of supporting the debate camp that we used to do. And she said, like, ask Bob Embry, go ask him, right? And I kind of laughed because I knew of his reputation at the time. And she was like, I'm serious, you need to go ask him. And then I actually had one conversation with him back in 2014 in his office. And it was an interesting conversation. It was respectful back and forth. One of the things that he said during this meeting, though, that I thought that just for me was everything I needed to hear. He said, Dayvon, people accuse me of thinking I can socially engineer progress for Black people in their communities. People accuse me of that. And he says, and you know what? I do think I can do that. I do think I can socially engineer progress for Black folks, right? And it's an open secret. It's an open secret around town that he,
which also by then would mean that he could socially engineer devolution.
My argument
right?
to him is
okay.
My argument to him is he's not qualified to do that. He's only qualified to engineer Black devolution because all he knows really of Black folks for the most part is the sociology of our oppression, right? But I imagine there are folks like that in places all around the United States who aren't elected officials. They're not high profile. He's very careful of what he says in public. He never has to articulate his position. And that's part of the frustrating thing that happens in terms of LBS over here is there are lots of folks that will power. They won't engage us in public. And Embry doesn't have to. And what he does have are people for whom operationalize his perspective. And he's one person in a network of folks, right? So I use him because he's kind of the most prominent of them. But there are other folks kind of in his networks that exercise tremendous power, right, in various different sectors. And unfortunately, because of how people get their money, they're not able to actually go after those people. So that's a part of what I'm saying about the Marilyn Mosby piece. It's like, yes, we should criticize Marilyn Mosby and her policies, and LBS has and others have. But in terms of power to really change the material conditions of Black people, Bob Embry has and his networks have tremendous power over who gets to even be in the political game. And ultimately, as I've said on many occasions, what we need is to build independent Black political, electoral, civic infrastructure such that we can run our own folks, and we shouldn't have to engage Black politicians that are straddling these worlds. But that's the reality of the situation we're currently in. We're dealing with elected officials for whom are straddling those worlds. I'm clear about their limitations. And unfortunately, it's easier for people, I think, and let me say this, and this is going to seem really harsh, but I feel like, and this goes into what you were saying earlier in terms of the nuance piece. One of my biggest criticisms of people who self-describe themselves as on the left in local politics, and I can speak for Baltimore because I'm steeped in the kind of civic and political life here, is that I don't see folks who describe themselves on the left as having a tremendous base of support amongst working class Black people. It's easier to go to the hipster crowd where they fetishize Black political struggle and to do protests and to be on Twitter, talking the game, as opposed to actually having to engage working class Black people for whom don't agree with the politics offer it. And you have to gain their trust to get to a point to where they'll align more with your politics. That doesn't seem, I just don't know that a lot of the folks who I think were the most angry about this, I don't find them necessarily to be people with strong working class bases that actually can impact policy and distribution of resources here.
As I said to you privately, one of the more incendiary lines in your piece that I was expecting would cause some consternation in some circles is here where you write, but using the frame of corruption to, because in other words, a lot of the critique or some of the critique that I heard, at least, that I'm sure you've heard, is that Mosby is corrupt, and if you show any anything other than that in your messaging, you are hurting the Black radical struggle. But you're saying here, but using the frame of corruption to characterize the thrust of Mosby's political activity is not only dangerous to their political futures, that is the futures of the Mosbys, but this is the continuation of a trend of rendering corruption as inherent to Black political activity, allowing legitimized white corruption to be normalized and acceptable. This should be as concerning to those who don't support Marilyn and Nick Mosby as those who do. I find this to be a very nuanced, and sophisticated approach here, because a lot of people, myself included, find it a very easy position to take, to say, I'm not engaging these corporate Democrats. But at the same time, I'm not doing the kind of work that you're doing. I'm not engaged in local communities in the way that you are. So whether it's you or Lawrence, for instance, Lawrence Grand Prix, who's come here to give very, I think, complicated views of defund the police and other efforts, your perspectives become very nuanced. So I would want you to tease out that point a little bit. I found that to be a very compelling point. So where do we draw this line then between being critical of Black politicians, but then giving coverage to the real white corruption that has, to the extent that you're talking about here, more power than the politicians we claim to be critical of, and then accuse people like you of showing support for, when that's really not what you're doing. But anyway,
yeah, that's a really good point. So here's the thing, and I appreciate the way you framed it, where you framed it as someone who's doing the work that I'm doing. You understand why that nuance would make sense, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that LBS prides itself on is the ability to actually impact policy and the distribution of resources, right? We see that as chiefly what a political organization is supposed to be able to do, to be able to deliver, real material impacts to the community, both in terms of our obligation, but also as a way to base build, as a way to build a bigger base that will then go along with us in terms of our, radical politics. And I think sometimes what happens, I think people talk about institutions, but have a hard time not understanding, or have a hard time not actually talking about individuals. Like, I think a lot of times people make things about personalities and not about political analysis. And I think a part of this happened, particularly on Twitter, is that, I've talked about, like, Twitter is just a bunch of people, groupthink, have opinions, varying degrees of folks who actually do stuff. And I think a part of what I'm getting people to understand is, let's take the personalities out of it, right? Like, if you take Nick and Marilyn out of it and just do an objective political analysis, if Black political life is rendered as inherently criminal, then any one of us who are able to use our organizing to come to any sort of power, that will be directed at us. And I'll give an example of that LBS has dealt with, which is that one of the efforts that we worked on is the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. 3% of these property tax dollars are able to be reinvested in youth programming, and we made it an emphasis to make sure that a majority of those dollars go in the hands of Black community-based organizations to serve youth, whereas traditionally these resources would have gone to big mainstream corporate nonprofits. We were able to do that as a result of our base and using our political muscle to be able to direct resources in. So there, and 2/3 of the portfolio of those resources have gone to Black community-based organizations. Now, what happened was that the media characterized that. There were a bunch of essentially a media attacks on it, characterizing it as corrupt, trying to find ways to connect what we were doing to, Catherine Pugh and the Healthy Housing scandal. And part of what happened was there was an audit that was done by the then mayor, Jack Young, of the youth fund to make sure that there was no connection between the youth fund and Catherine Pugh. The audit found that there was no connection, right? But I say that to say that in an effort to try to get more resources into the hands of Black people, the notion of criminality and unfortunately a lot of our people buy into the propaganda because it's fed to us over and over and over again. Oh, it's Black people running it, somebody's stealing money. Or it's Black people running it, it must be corrupt. So then what happens then when you're the person with those politics that are trying to drive those resources, that weapon gets used against you. Now, fortunately, we have a strong enough base where the media propaganda hasn't been able to undermine our efforts. But it's just, it's the point I'm making is that point is important if you're actually trying to achieve political change. Like you're actually trying to make things move in politics. If you're not trying to, then yeah, you wouldn't find that point to be a meaningful point, right? And so that's a part of why for us it was important to put that out.
So again, for me, what seems to be the crux of all the issues whenever we engage in discussion of your work seems to be the difference between those who have sort of tangible connections to grassroots elements of the communities they're claiming to serve, those who have less of that connection, who seem to be too focused on digital platforms as opposed to actual. The only caveat to that, and if I have any of that wrong, please correct me. But the only caveat to that for me would be that on some level there's this line of maybe the flaw isn't inherent Black criminality, but the flaw is inherent criminality of anyone who engages in these arenas of political organization or activism. In other words, not activism or organization, but political activity. In other words, anyone who goes into mainstream political work ends up being corrupted. So that leaves room for some of us on the outside to say we should abandon that space, organize outside of those spaces, organize, I don't know, just try to organize ourselves outside of those areas and to prepare for some sort of other form of engagement with those mainstream political spaces. Or maybe that caveat is just the group of people you're talking about who aren't, at least in this moment, doing the work that you're doing. So so maybe, without hostility or even disagreement, to say like we're in a different space, and then say like, but for those looking to engage where you all are, there has to be that level of sophistication and nuance that some seem to miss when they're more digitally situated. Anyway.
Yeah. So two things I want to say to that. The first is that one of the things that I think has happened is people are so used to things working a certain way that sometimes people have a hard time not projecting what they're used to onto what's happening. So here's what I mean by that. I've seen people characterize our ability to get things done as being connected to Black establishment folks, right? Now, if you research LBS and our work, there's really no credible argument that can be made that we are sponsored by any corporate interest, that we were put on by some group of white folks that wanted to put us on. Like our organization was founded in 2010, and we have history of work, doing stuff before that. So we've done work over many years in the community where we built up such a strong base that I've had elected officials say to me, the reason they're scared of us is because when they go to their community meetings and that grandmother's like, well, LBS said this, are you doing that? That impacts them electorally, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people who are doing organizing may not have that body of work of having delivered material, concrete things that people remember, right? Whether it's things like working at a community center, right? Or doing a series of community cleanups, things that aren't like revolutionary in terms of like their politics. But when you do things over a period of time where people see you in the community and they see you with them, on a variety of occasions where you're not getting paid for it, right? Where they see that you're just here to try to build community, then over time, even there are people who don't like us personally, who if you ask them about LBS, they say, they're consistent, they do work. These are the things they did, right? And so when you've done that work over a period of time, then we're able to then use the power that comes from having, and that to me is Pan-Africanism as a methodology of politics, to say that it is our base that makes us a thing. People don't want to invite me to a lot of the rooms that we get invited to, but I get invited to certain rooms now because they know that if we say something about it, it'll be a thing. And even this article about the Baltimore Brew, it's able to be a thing because, and I got a bunch of calls from a variety of folks in the community who said, thank you for writing it. Because we feel like they scrutinize Black people in ways they don't scrutinize white folks. Right. So that's one thing. And I think people they project onto that what they see other people do. And I'm not upset about that. I can see why folks who haven't seen folks move resources that way just assume that, oh, they must be doing what everyone else is doing. Right. The second thing I want to say to that, though, is that I think that it's okay. And this is a place where, maybe you and I disagree, and maybe some of the other viewers may disagree. I think in terms of being able to improve the quality of life of Black people, I don't think that we can afford to cede all the political space to the people who ideologically we think are wrong. I deal with a lot of people on a regular basis. Let me tell you, one of the things that a lot of particularly the younger Black elected officials that in my age group, because we've never as an organization endorsed a candidate. And anytime, folks in my peer group who run for elected office, they say, Dayvon, look, I'm on the stuff y'all on, but I'm gonna get in there. And then when I get in there, then I'm gonna be real Black. And every time, that gets said to us, we say back to them, all of y'all say the same thing. All of y'all say that y'all gonna walk this line and get in there and be so Black. And however you got there is what you're gonna be when you get there, right? But I think this is an honest belief that many of them have, right? They don't have the level of political education that you or I may have to know that that's a dead end. And I just don't think, so these are folks that I have to engage. These are folks that I have to, on certain pieces of legislation, I have to push them in our direction. And so, and some of them are crooks, but there are many of them who are folks who they just don't share our ideology. And there's no amount of arguing with them that's going to take them all the way to our side. And I just don't think we can afford to not engage that at all. At least for LBS, we're clear that we engage it on terms that we think live up to, at some point in the future, emptying into African sovereignty and Pan-Africanism. But we just know that in terms of our work, we can't cede that space. We have to engage that in some way, shape, or form.
So, but what I'm seeing, and I think they're, I'm looking at some of the chat and some of the comments, which I think are themselves disingenuous, Ricky, to be perfectly honest. If there's a problem with what Dayvon is saying, I think lay it out and we can talk about it. But to suggest that anybody up here is being disingenuous is itself disingenuous. So I'm not here for that. We can do better than that. But if, what about the criticism that I'm seeing here, folks, that the juvenile and pretrial detention, malicious prosecution of Keith Davis, and, you all being seen as support. Again, when I read the piece, I don't see you all as saying you're supporting her. I don't see that at all. I don't see this as support for Marilyn Mosby. I see this as, again, you being engaged in a part of the political arena I'm not in, and making a different argument about the approach to local politicians, et cetera. Now, again, I don't know that I fully understand your argument or what you all are doing, but or said differently, I don't know that I fully agree or don't necessarily. But I don't agree that it's bad faith, and I think the history of LBS is clear on that. So even Ricky, you saying stuff about them making stuff up. I mean, what here is made up? Lay it out, Ricky. You can you're way better than that. So I can't support what you're doing in the chat right there. So we've talked
and
about
let
at
me address,
BPM how we're going to approach people in the chat being hostile and disingenuous, and even when our own crew seems to be doing it, I want to step up and say that. So Ricky, lay out the critique, and we can have the discussion or whatever. But that's I'm not supportive of that. Go ahead, Dayvon. Go ahead.
yeah, and and like I said, we've confronted Marilyn Mosby about policies that we thought were problematic. We've also worked with her. So, people mentioned the holding of juveniles in pre-trial detention, which is something that folks have criticized her for. We also worked with her to pass a vacatur bill that allowed people who were incarcerated for false testimony of corrupt police officers for them to vacate their convictions, right? And so this is kind of what I was saying a moment ago about, like, we feel like we can't just cede that. Like, we feel like we have to engage, some of the people who are in political office in ways that I think some people feel icky, right? For some people aren't like the ideal of, revolutionary purity, but it's for us, it's a part of being able to get it done. And I think, unfortunately, for folks who don't want to engage in that, that makes sense to me. But I think, but it's interesting because I'm making a point about in this piece around the way that notions of inherent criminality has been projected on Black civic and political life. And from a lot of the people that are critics, these aren't folks that are going after the Bob Embrys of the world, right? These aren't the folks that are going. The Greater Baltimore Committee is the seat where corporate power sits. These are the people who determine many of the Black elected officials who get elected. And these are the people for whom are the consensus builders of the status quo in terms of the politics of Black people in office. We've directly challenged them on numerous occasions in public. When we pushed back against mandatory minimums, like it was the GBC was a big part of that. So I'm just saying that to say that I say in the piece, critiques of Marilyn Mosby are important. We have offered critiques of Marilyn Mosby, but I think people have gotten so consumed in the personality part of it, as opposed to stepping back and just thinking about, when we're talking about the masses of Black people, like, what are the institutions that are the drivers of the institutions that harm Black people, right? And for me, that's something that I want us to be able to do more of. The same way that folks are as critical of Marilyn Mosby, I want that for Bob Embry.
Hey, listen, well, one thing we have to do is have you back when we got a better connection, because I admit that you sound clear enough, but the visual is jacked up. Yeah, anyway, I admit, well, my whole thing is I'm uncomfortable with engagement with any commercial, mainstream, corporate, whatever. But I'm not doing the kind of work that you're doing, and I'm not engaged in the struggle in the same exact way that you are. The other thing that beyond knowing more about the history and the work of LBS, makes this a different, and makes my response to what you've written here different, is also, well, not only that I don't see it as defending Mosby, but also that I don't see you or LBS using your position and the work that you do to attack those, not necessarily to your left, but in other left spaces doing other forms of work. And that's always what quote unquote triggers me or wants me to become upset or critical myself. So in other words, we're all not maybe doing the same thing. We're approaching these struggles the same way, but you're not attacking those on your left, and you're not attacking people trying to do independent other kinds of organizational work. You're saying that for us doing this kind of work, this is the way we need to engage, and these are some of the kind of criticisms that we need to raise. And anyway, so I would encourage people, we'll put it, when we post this video, we'll put the link to the piece up there, but we certainly encourage people to go to lbsbaltimore.com and read the piece themselves and check out the other work that you all are doing. And we'll certainly want to continue the conversation because anyway, but any last thoughts before we do, anything that we didn't get to that you want to make sure we get cleared up in all of this before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the last thing I'll say is that I talked about in the beginning the progressive mainstream that we talked about before. And one of the things that I think undergirds not all, but much of the criticism from this piece and the argument that we've made has to do with the fact that there are a lot of Black folks that are proximate to a lot of these kind of progressive, hipster, mainstream nonprofit spaces. And the reason why I make it a point to reiterate that is because for me, a part of what that signals, because I hear a lot of people talk about working class Black people, but what I feel like I observe is a contempt for working class Black people. Working class Black folks are diverse in ideology, diverse in perspective, diverse in just the different ways that people show up. And I think part of the reason why LBS is able to have the base that we have developed is because we demonstrate a level of respect for working class Black people, regardless of their ideology, but try to bring people along in terms of, the work that we're doing, the perspective that we offer, hoping to demonstrate to them, to prove that our work is worthy of their support. And that's the approach that we take in terms of organizing and building. And I just think that there's a dynamic that's emerging that just refuses to actually do the work of building with working class Black people who don't agree. And that work is very hard. But in terms of building an independent Black political base that can move these politics, I find it to be essential. And my hope is that those who are engaged in political struggle can recognize that. And again, the point of this piece is to recognize that the ability to demonize Black political activity that would carry our ideology is something that's impacted by this dynamic. The Baltimore Brew in Baltimore, that is a non-Black publication, being able to determine what people think of Black people, that is something that for us is important to fight against, because that's a weapon that will get used against Black people with an ideology more in line with ours. That's just an important lesson I think we got to learn, and then a lesson that we got to heed to, regardless of if we don't like or don't support the people from whom it's being used against.
Right on. Well, my man, for now, as Fred Hampton used to say, we say peace to you because we know you're out there fighting for it, and I appreciate you. Definitely want to have you back to talk more about this, and encourage people to go to lbsbaltimore.com and support the work. And certainly at least read the joint. And again, in the context of the work you all do. See, that's the other part that always frustrates me with some of the with how it goes in this struggle. Like I make a mistake and all of a sudden 20 years of work gets thrown out the window and people act all brand new because, well, anyway. So I'll just leave that there. But so I just encourage people, myself included, like give some room for people to, we can disagree or whatever, But anyway, my man, I want to catch up with you again, and peace to you and LBS, and thanks again, man.
I appreciate it, bro. Take care, man.
All right, man. Anytime. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.